Today we're talking about MIDI keyboards. What's the best one you could buy? Which is the best brand? What are the most important features? What are the considerations you need to keep in mind before buying one? We're answering all those questions in this video. Let's get it. So I think one of the first things that folks need to ask themselves when they're gonna buy a MIDI keyboard is, what do I need one for? Most of us, including myself, for the first many years that I made music, really only used the MIDI keyboard for making beats, for messing around and trying to find melodies that I thought would work on a beat that I was making. But most MIDI keyboards, as you'll notice, have a lot more capabilities than that. You'll probably see that my main MIDI keyboard, the Akai MPK49, has a bunch of knobs, has a bunch of sliders, and to be honest with you, I barely use any of those things. And the reason why is because my main use case for that MIDI keyboard is just for playing around when I'm making beats, coming up with melodies, trying to find different chords that I could use on beats. All the extra knobs, all the extra sliders, you have to pre-program for them to work properly. And more often than not, I never take the time to do so. Am I using the word sliders properly? I keep thinking about like mini burgers whenever I say sliders. Are they called sliders? I'm probably hungry. But yeah, I think that's the first thing you need to think about. Like, what DAW am I using? Am I actually gonna be using all of these programmable knobs and sliders? Is that something that I really require from the MIDI keyboard that I get? So probably in like the first 5 years that I started making music, I never really used any of those customizable knobs and keys, but later on they became very useful to me once I started making Ableton performances. And that brings us to the question of like MIDI keyboard versus MIDI controller. MIDI keyboard I think is more focused on just having like a keyboard where you can play the keys and to come up with melodies, whereas a MIDI controller has other functions like programmable keys for you to control your DAW in special ways. For example, now that I'm doing a lot of those Ableton Live performances, I'm able to customize a lot of the keys on that keyboard so they can serve as like play record buttons, they can be effect on and off buttons. The sliders, I can program them to certain parameters and effects that I'm using. So for example, if there's a part of the performance where I want to really up the reverb on a song, I can map the slider in the keyboard to that reverb effect so I can control it throughout the performance. But like I said, this is a very specific use case and I think most people don't need this. The second thing that you need to consider is how many keys do you want to have? I am a fan of having at least 49 keys like I have here. I also have a larger keyboard there, which I'm actually able to use as a MIDI keyboard as well. I think that the sweet spot is 49 keys, 49 or 61. I think it's the nice sweet spot between the 25 key, which is kind of the absolute minimum, and then like 88 keys, which is like a full-size piano. And usually 49 key keyboards fit perfectly on your desk. Now, if you're a producer who's an actual piano player and you're probably going to be using the entire keyboard, I suggest you get a full-on 88 key keyboard. That way you don't limit yourself. Most of us producers who aren't pianists don't need 88 keys, to be honest, because we're not doing all that much. We're not getting that crazy. But the reason I wanted to have a full 88 key keyboard in my studio is because one of the producers that I work really closely with is a full-on pianist and he be wilding out, and I want him to be able to record those full-on takes without me having to worry about the fact that he's gonna run out of keys when trying to record those MIDI performances into the DAW. One more thing that you need to consider when picking a MIDI keyboard is the sensitivity. So sensitivity with MIDI keyboards is exactly what it sounds like, how sensitive these keys are. And obviously keyboards are inspired by real pianos, and the way real pianos work is that when you hit the key lightly, it produces a lighter sound than when you bang on the keys. It's supposed to be much louder. And MIDI keyboards try to replicate that so that the lighter you hit the key on the MIDI keyboard, it sends a signal to the DAW letting it know that you hit the key lighter and the volume should be lower. And in Ableton, that'll show up as velocity. So you'll see that the lighter you hit the key, the lower the velocity and the quieter the sound, versus when you hit the key real hard, the higher the velocity and the louder the sound. Most MIDI keyboards that you see on the market will say that they are semi-weighted, so they do have some sensitivity, but it's not as sensitive as like a real piano. One thing I would suggest everyone do before buying a MIDI keyboard is go into like a Guitar Center or a Sam Ash or any local music store and actually kind of trying to play the keyboard and see how it feels, because there's definitely some that feel like cheaper than others and like less pleasurable to play. And overall, if you're unfamiliar with this concept of sensitivity, it's nice to kind of play with different keyboards and get a feel for what I'm saying. I try not to let price be like the indicator of whether something is good or bad, because it's not always the case that if something is more expensive, it's of higher quality than the other thing. However, when it comes to MIDI keyboards, I will say it is nice to spend a little bit more if you can. When I first started making music as a teenager, I kept buying $99 keyboards. I remember I had several M Audio keyboards. I had a bunch of different brands that I can't even remember. But the reason I had to keep buying them every 1 or 2 years is because they kept breaking. And eventually I was like, you know what? I'm gonna invest in a good keyboard. And I ended up buying this Akai MPK49. I promise you, I have had this keyboard for over 10 years and it still works just as good as it did when I first got it. And I didn't even pay full price for it. I got it on eBay. And so I'm not saying that this is a guarantee and that everyone's experience will be the same as mine, but if you have the opportunity to spend a little bit more on a MIDI keyboard, somewhere in the $300 to $350 range, I think that it is a worthy investment. Instead of having to buy a new keyboard every 1 or 2 years because something keeps breaking, you can buy a MIDI keyboard that's gonna last you many, many, many years. And again, I am not exaggerating. I have had this keyboard for 10 years and I literally cannot find a reason to get another one. Now, throughout the years, I have picked up some additional keyboards like this one, but it's not because I needed a new keyboard. It's mostly just because during my performances, what I like to do is assign different sounds to different keyboards and stuff like that. So it's not because this one doesn't work as well as it should. It's literally just because I need another keyboard to pull off some trick during my performance. And the last question I'll answer for this video, it's what's the best brand for MIDI keyboards? And there's a lot of good brands out there. I think each brand has a different focus and like a different primary customer. I think that now that I've started to use Ableton, there are certain brands that I find are creating devices with Ableton more in mind than others. For example, the Launch Key keyboards, those keyboards to me are created with Ableton in mind. Like the way you're able to trigger clips with that keyboard, I think is really useful. And I think Arturia is doing similar stuff with their keyboards. I don't want to get into the differences of comparing every single brand of keyboard here because this video would be half an hour long at least, but what I would say is keep the DAW that you're using in mind, keep your use case in mind, which was the first question that I brought up in this video. What is it that's most important for you to have for your MIDI keyboard? Keep those things in mind, and I think that picking the brand becomes a lot easier once you answer those questions for yourself. At the end, if all you want is a keyboard with good enough sensitivity that you could use for playing melodies or coming up with melodies when making beats, I think you have a lot of options, and at that point, what I'd say, it comes down to just which one feels the best to you. Hop into one of those stores and start playing around with the different ones. Which one do you like the most? Which one visually do you like the most? Which one feels the most comfortable when you're playing? Which one feels the best? But ultimately, I think there are a ton of great options out there. I got my Akai keyboard. Arturia makes some great keyboards. The Novation Launch Key folks are making great keyboards. Ask yourself some of the questions that I brought up throughout this video and see what are the most important things for you, and I'm sure you'll make a great decision. And I hope that the MIDI keyboard you select lasts you 10 years like this one has lasted me. And that's all, folks. As usual, create with what you have. You don't need much. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new around here, and peace out. Much love.